welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ben Spatz, and I am the director of the Center for Experimental Practices, which is a small and increasingly precarious research center based in Huddersfield in Northern England. I would like to start by acknowledging that modern England owes its existence to ongoing extractive and neo-colonial relations around the world, and the rights of the peoples colonized by this country to live and work freely here and to participate in the determination of its future remain unceded. For anyone who would like to know more about the Center for Experimental Practices, I've just dropped the webpage link in the chat, and you can check out some events that are upcoming. In addition to this session and next week's session of the Whiteness and Sound Studies series, we will then be taking a couple weeks off before going ahead with the Lines of Flight series, which is another online seminar series. It's going to be really exciting. This theme this year is new laboratories, so we're looking at hybrid laboratories in academic, non-academic, and para-academic spaces. Please join us for that as well. Thanks to Colin Frank, as always, for doing lots of amazing technical logistics work behind the scene. Thanks to Sophie for coordinating and hosting and coming up with the whole idea of this series. The brilliant Sophie Fetokaki, I now hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this fourth and penultimate session in the Whiteness and Sound Studies seminar series. I'm just going to talk for a second about the series and about how it's going to go for today's event. So this series is all about thinking race in relation to the sonic and in the context of sound studies, sort of critiquing the whiteness and the global north focus of the scholarly canon. And also unsettling some theoretical and philosophical assumptions when it comes to listening, sound, silence, noise, and other related concepts. As a researcher, artist, curator here, I'm coming from years of training and professional practice in classical and contemporary music, specifically voice, but other areas too. And this series is kind of about looking at how... there was a bit of an echo. Okay. How whiteness manifests in the more kind of avant-garde experimental music practices, sound practices, but also in the new materialisms of sound studies. For reasons of scope and coherence of this area of study, it wasn't really possible to have this be a totally interdisciplinary series, which is a kind of, I would always love to do that, and then it is always impractical somehow. But we wanted to keep the door open to cross-disciplinary discussion, because obviously all of areas of knowledge and practice have their own sort of configuration of these issues, and so in order to keep that door open, we're really happy to have Arabella Stanger with us this evening, or now, as I guess we're all in different places. And Arabella is going to speak first, and then after her presentation, there'll be a cross-disciplinary discussion between Arabella, myself, and Ben, and will maybe to some extent be sort of team music and team theater. I don't know. Of course, we all have other areas of our practice and scholarship as well, but that's roughly how it'll be. And during that second part where we're having that discussion, you're welcome to drop questions in the chat, and we can take them up in the discussion. And then after that, we'll just open it completely, and you can ask questions using your video or microphone or however you prefer. So I'd like to welcome Arabella Stanger. Arabella is a senior lecturer in drama, theatre and performance at the University of Sussex in the UK. She's author of Dancing on Violent Ground, Utopia as Dispossession in Euro-American Theatre Dance, that came out in 2021. And the book was awarded TaPRA's David Bradby Monograph Prize in 2022. With Mimi Haddon and Michael Lawrence, she is co-editing the forthcoming volume of Disco, Music, Dance and Style. Newer research projects include pieces on dance and horror, and on dance, factory labor and imperial extraction. Arabella, welcome.
Thank you, Sophie. Can you hear me? Good. All right. Hello. Thanks for coming, everybody. It's really nice to be in this Teams room together. I just want to say, first of all, I've just been made aware that colleagues at Huddersfield are facing an newly intensified precarious employment situation. So I just want to express my solidarity with all of you Huddersfield colleagues and start in that spirit. And also huge thanks to Sophie, Ben, Colin and the whole team who've put together this brilliant series in like really elegant and engaging ways. It's an honor to be part of it, actually, alongside all the other brilliant speakers. So thanks for having me. Yeah, as Sophie says, I'm going to share some research. This is actually from the book that Sophie mentioned that was published like almost 3 years ago now, but it feels really, really fresh and distant to me, if that makes sense. So yeah, well, I'll share a bit of that book here. I think I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes and we'll watch a little clip and then Ben, Sophie and I will have a conversation. Yeah, so I wanted to start by saying actually that I was really compelled by the description for this talk series, including its call to examine how whiteness and coloniality operate in the reception and theorization of sound. My own approach, and this is what Sophie mentioned, how cool it is to have an interdisciplinary conversation in response to that call. My own approach to this question is, first of all, to think about dance and movement. So my focus today will be on choreographic form, but there's every reason, of course, to think about movement and sound together. And so I hope that's something that we can talk about more later in our discussion. And I'm excited to find out with an audience of sound people how ideas and thinking and practices of sound might be already in the topics that I've researched without my knowing. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that discussion. But perhaps more importantly, my other approach to the question of whiteness and coloniality in relation to practices like sound and movement is to begin with what I understand as the politics of location. That's my sort of I guess, epistemological, methodological and political position that I'm coming from in one way. What I mean by this is to think about the spatial practices of historically specific forms of white supremacy, of colonial, including settler colonial and imperial projects, and to ask how dance is bound up with those projects through its relationship to land. And that's what the book's about. And thanks, Ben, especially actually for their expanded land acknowledgement that you offered as this call opened. I really appreciated that. So my talk today will be about dance, land and racialized dispossession in New York City. For this reason, and before going on, I want to acknowledge that as we gather here, students in New York are occupying Hamilton Hall, an institutional building of Columbia University in West Upper Manhattan, as part of their courageous transformation of their campus spaces in the face of draconian institutional pushback into what a transformation of their campus space into what they have named their Gaza Solidarity Encampment. The students' takeover of their university space, as we know, enacts their protest against the genocide currently unfolding in Gaza and calls for an end to their university's complicit investments in Israeli settler colonialism and military occupation in Palestine. I feel it's important to start with this acknowledgement, and I felt like I couldn't start without it, to be honest with you. Not only to recognise the spatialised struggle taking place in the very same neighbourhood of New York about which I'm going to speak in a moment, but also because to reach for anti-colonial understandings of land at this very moment, as I'm going to try to do today, is necessarily to speak also in solidarity with the people of Palestine. And so I want to begin my talk by reflecting on a piece of writing by the scholar Linda Tabar, whose current book project is an attempt, as Tabar explains, to think from Palestine. In a recent talk titled The Indigenous Anti-Colonial, about the book that Tabar is developing, she shares an important reminder about settler colonial dispossession and practices of resistance to it. As she explains about radical traditions of thought and practice that her research covers, including Indigenous survivance, resurgence, and Black fugitivity, and this is what Tabar says, I go on to quote her, each in their own way, these radical traditions of thought and practice has tried to nourish and sustain a people through a system set on their captivity or destruction, without submitting to its ends and claiming the ground to live otherwise. Close quote. So the phrase, the ground to live, is important because it reminds us of the embeddedness of people and forms of social life with the land, and likewise of the centrality of geographic and spatialized practice, both to the eliminationist projects of racialized violence and of life in and towards liberation, claiming the ground to live otherwise. And this is, yeah, I heard Tabar's talk a month ago, and that phrase has been sitting with me ever since, the ground, claiming the ground to live otherwise. As a deeply spatialized practice, dance too is a practice of social life bound with geographic projects. As a dance scholar and following work like Tabar's in anti-colonial thought, what I want to do is research that finds the fissures in the spatial practices of settler, colonial, imperial, and white supremacist projects, and to seek out those fissures in perhaps unlikely places. And I'm thinking back to what Sophie said earlier, looking for practices of spatial violence and racial violence in experimentalist, progressive artistic projects that may or may not sit in the canon, but definitely declare and pursue a more progressive sociality, but may not sit apart from the forms of violence that Tabar's work thinks against. And I'm seeking out those fissures in these projects as a way of learning from and hopefully moving with and in coalition with radical traditions and thought and practice that claim the ground to live otherwise. So that's the sort of broader commitments of the project. And today I'm going to share some research from my book, Dancing on Violent Ground, which is about the histories of spatial and racial dispossession underwriting Euro-American theatre dance. And Colin, I wonder if you can show the first slide, actually. Colin's offered to operate the slides because I didn't think I could handle it. Thank you. And so as a way in, I turn to a piece of guidance for researchers offered by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, ever brilliant in her short film, Geographies of Racial Capitalism. So could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so she says this, being a good geographer means going to look and see, and then to challenge oneself in one's description of what one has seen. I find Gilmore's critical imperative for geographers to be incredibly suggestive for thinking about dance, and it's provided a guiding principle for my work. Writing this book was a way of challenging myself, as Gilmore suggests, in my description of something I love. I wrote this book specifically because I wanted to understand how the art forms on which I was raised as a white, middle-class British dancer, and which have provided me and others with experiences of profound exhilaration and discovery, ballet, but also more progressive forms of modern and contemporary dance, how these forms secure and conceal forms of violence. And here I don't mean violence in the sense of physical or psychological traumas for individuals that may arise in the practice of these arts, although that is the case, and there's research and activism addressing those physical and psychological traumas. But here I'm focusing more on the material histories of imperial, colonial and racial subjection that ground these forms in a broader institutional structural sense. So I'm curious about this problem of dance and violence, not because I think dance is especially harmful, more harmful than other cultural practices, but contrarily because of all the ways that dance potentializes, it seems to me, something intensely hopeful. Vitality, release, bodily agency, and even forms of community and social resistance and liberation. As a dancer who has felt the hopeful bodily and social states potentialized through dance, I wanted to ask questions about the overwhelming positivity that seems to cling to dance as an artistic practice, but also the overwhelming positivity that seems to cling to the scholarly study of dance. And to ask how these promises, when played out in some of the choreographies on which I and so many others are raised, because these are choreographies that dominate the Euro-American canon and therefore dominate what is taught and showed in theatre houses around the global north. How these promises, which I see as being tethered to forms of white liberal hope, can come to naturalize or even euphemize material realities of social violence. And just a little bit more on the kind of the broader framing, and then I'm going to turn to talk about the example that I mentioned in New York. I just want to pause and explain a bit what I mean by the term violence here, because I think that's important. It's kind of the critical lineage of that term that I find useful. Is again thinking in relation to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of violence, the cause of premature deaths. That's her definition. As it signals not forms of individual harm, but forms of structural supremacy, devastation, and attrition, through which certain populations are over time denied the full conditions for life. Gilmore's definition of violence is in this respect tied, of course, into her much quoted definition of racism. And that's the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. The importance, and I think the kind of crucial importance of this definition of violence and racism for dance and possibly sound research too, is specifically its framing of racism as structural violence, something that persists beyond and beneath individual prejudice, beyond and beneath denial of difference, and actually provides the very ground on which cultural institutions are enacted. So what I wanted to do with this project was to see what could be learned from the kind of possibilities and calls and demands actually that Gilmore opens up for dance research. Both in her critical geographic practice of looking again at something you think you know, but also her powerful call to understand racial violence as a geographic practice. Thinking back to TaPRA's ground to live otherwise, though, I also want to emphasize before moving on that Gilmore's work, abolitionist as it is in its political orientation, also demands that understanding and seeking to dismantle violent grounds is and has to be tantamount to claiming the ground to live otherwise. And so what I hope to argue for here is not a disabling political pessimism, where the focus on violence is an end to itself, because it never is or should not be, I suppose, is what I've learned from Gilmore. But instead that a deeper consciousness of the material situation of dance might lead towards acts of social transformation. And for this reason, the spirit with which I've approached this research is that to be deeply skeptical about dance's exuberant acts, and especially dances on which I was raised embedded in whiteness and that reinforced my own inheritance as a white dancer, to be deeply skeptical about those dances can in fact to engage in a profoundly hopeful gesture. So that's the sort of the spirit of the research. Okay, a cat has just entered the room and is ripping up my sofa. So if you hear any strange noises, that's what it is. So that's a good pause moment. And I'm going to now read some passages from the book with a focus on the choreographer George Balanchine, who was the founder choreographer of New York City Ballet. His celebrated pas de deux from his 1957 ballet Argonne, and its relationship to urban depopulation and community resistance in mid-century New York. And this is where I find that I'm actually talking about a plot of land in New York that's a 15-minute bus journey from the current student protests unfolding in Columbia University. Okay. So, Balanchine, like many white scholars in the field of dance studies, I grew up watching and dancing ballet. Over the years, the visions and sensations of this way of moving became habitual to me as I experienced ballet's movements as a life's practice of harmonic exhilaration. During my early years as a ballet student, by the way, I dropped out of ballet school. That's important to say as well. During my early years as a ballet student, I was exhilarated more than anything by the work of George Balanchine. So this is like confessional. I really loved Balanchine, loved the work. And I think it was because, and it really excited me and kind of did something for me as a young ballet dancer. And I think it's because I'd never seen ballet look that way, pure dynamism, I felt. And especially with Balanchine's work to Stravinsky's music, and as you know, they were really important to each other as artistic collaborators. And Balanchine's Stravinsky ballets are also my favorite Balanchine ballets. I'd never heard ballet sound that way, with dancers brought by the music into embodiments on the edge. High speed, sky high, toppling over, risky moves, all coordinated with the most methodical of compositional calculations. It seemed to me that this was ballet and ballet dancers released. So this bit of research about Balanchine represents a small attempt to follow Gilmore's advice for geographers and to challenge myself in these descriptions of my love for his work, which feels deeply personal, but is also remarkably widespread, the terms I've used to describe what is exciting and dynamic about Balanchine's work. What if dance and dancers were to take up Gilmore's geographic imperative and commit to looking beneath the movement forms that we love, and that maybe have even delivered dance as an exceptional site of release? What if we were to approach the idealisms embedded in these dances as things that are also bound up with forces of racialization, territorial expansion, and spatial dispossession, which I think they are in Balanchine's case? Today, I'm going to try and follow that idea through the pas de deux for his ballet Argonne. And maybe we can go to the next slide, actually, so you can see, and the one after that. Yeah. So we can look at it whilst I'm talking. This was made in 1957 with the dancers Diana Adams and Arthur Mitchell, who you see here. 7 years after it was made, Argonne was performed on the first 2 nights of the New York City Ballet's opening week at Lincoln Center. And that's almost exactly 60 years ago to the day. Lincoln Center was the New York State Theater was opened as a new permanent home for the New York City Ballet. And Argonne was one of the works selected to be performed in the opening week. By thinking about Argonne's relationship to the land on which it was danced at Lincoln Center, and that's where I start actually in thinking about the work, the land on which it was danced in Lincoln Center, I rethink the dance's thrilling promise of an edgy, democratic kind of ballet And Argonne was once described by the poet Frank O'Hara as a function of American democracy. So I think by locating it on the land on which it was danced in 1964, bound with the project of launching the New York State Theatre, we can rethink O'Hara's conceit that this is a function of American democracy by thinking about this ballet in relation to the material context in the late 50s and 60s, where economically and racially devalued New Yorkers had been moved into a culture of unsteady residency so that this permanent home for ballet might take their place. With invigorating ballets like Argonne, I argue, Balanchine's work was perfectly poised to provide a kind of alibi for the civic and corporate practices of urban depopulation, authored by the white patrician elite with whom the New York City Ballet shared its patrons in the mid-century. And those patrons include several members of the Rockefeller family, one of whom will feature in the talk in a moment. In the longer version of this bit of research in the book, I focus on three parts of Balanchine's vision of what he very distinctly framed as an American ballet, as something that was sped up, upscaled and on the edge version of the Russian imperial classicism in which he was trained as a dancer and a young choreographer. So I look at three parts of his aesthetic in this respect: clearance, where his stage environments model wide open spaces; verticality, where dancers move like skyscrapers, and in fact many of the skyscrapers built around Midtown in this era were funded by the same people who funded New York City Ballet. And verticality, and precarity, that's the final one, where the choreography embraces displacement. So now I'm just going to focus for the sake of time on the final one of those, precarity, by thinking about how the pas de deux stages acts of balletic wobbling. So I think now it'd be good to watch a bit of the work, just 30 seconds, and I'm going to talk about kind of the wobble as a feature of Balanchine's choreography, and then come back to thinking about urban depopulation in Lincoln Center and how aesthetic and economic instability sit in tension in Balanchine's work. I hope that makes sense. So, Colin, do you reckon we could watch the clip now from Argonne? Is there sound as well, so we can hear Stravinsky?
I think I'll just have to reshare with sound. Just one moment.
Oh, thank you. It feels important, given we're a sound studies moment, that we should hear it, right?
So let's.
And the image glitches. I hope the sound won't glitch, but I think we'll get an impression, and then I'm going to talk through the clip anyway. So if you miss parts of it, it doesn't matter.
Apologies. Maybe I'll try one more time, but with actually a proper video player. And could you hear the sound there or no?
Yeah, just about.
Yeah,
Just
I could hear it. It was a bit quiet, but we could hear it.
So we'll try this one. Okay.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Colin. I think we can stop it there. Amazing, thanks. And can we go back to the slideshow? Awesome. And I think we need to go a couple of slides earlier. Cool. All right, that's perfect. Thank you. All right. So this short phrase, and you can find it on YouTube, so you can watch the whole thing. This short phrase makes clear Balanchine's emphasis on a balletic trope of technical precarity, the wobble. Unsteadiness and micro-displacements pervade this pas de deux, not only through Adams and Mitchell's, I think, quite extraordinary abilities to find something of a state of rest inside the tenseness of trembling limbs, but also through Balanchine's choreographic embrace of wobbling as dancing. So I'll just talk through what we saw and how I think about the wobble in here. So barely balanced first into a high-rise, yanked up arabesque attitude, and then into a nosedive arabesque penché, Adams is secured by only one of her hands, which grasps only one of Mitchell's. This grip occupies the central space between their bodies, while the difficulty of the contortion send that grip into a broad tremble. I think it's difficult to see, or maybe emphasized in the glitchy clip that we saw, but where you see their hands together, if you're watching, that is a broad tremble essentially occupies the central point of the stage throughout this section of the pas de deux, trembling arms. So the choreography then exposes the dancer's struggle against the probability of collapse. Lucia Ruprecht describes the typical concealment of off-balance in ballet by writing that, quote, a ballerina's trembling in her attitude on point or any other bravura pose was taken to be a mark of technical deficiency. You're not meant to wobble. You spend your life training in order to not wobble, or at least to make it look like you're not wobbling. Balanchine was not unversed in such a mandate, of course, as a Georgian-born St. Petersburg-trained student of the Russian Imperial Ballet School, who choreographed for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe before taking up in the early 30s the invitation of Lincoln Kirsten to found a purposefully American ballet. That's what he was asked to do in New York City. What is distinctive about Balanchine's unsteady classicism, as it's played out in Argonne, I think, is not so much that the wobbling is not disguised. So you can clearly see that the dancers are struggling to make it smoothly through the phrase. So Balanchine doesn't disguise the wobble, but the wobble is placed front and center. It's more than not disguising it. It's kind of emphasizing, pushing the wobble to the front and to the center. In other words, Balanchine stages instability. He gives ballet dancers no choice but to move through postural precarity, to flaunt their trembles, and to exhibit such an unsteadiness not as a technical deficiency, but as markers of the risks involved when taking up the challenge he extended to dancers in New York. And apparently this is what he said to his dancers: you must cover more space faster. And I'm thinking of the wobble as a kind of an artistic marker of that mandate to consume space faster. Bodily displacements run throughout Balanchine's work, and they have been powerfully identified by dance scholar Brenda Dixon Gottschild as a marker of what she calls the black text in Balanchine's Americanization of ballet. Gottschild makes her field-shaking assessment of Balanchine's work, and it really was a field-shaking assessment when Gottschild published her research on this and has kind of shaped the field ever since, not without upsetting some people, as you might imagine. She makes her field-shaking assessment of Balanchine's appropriation from Black dancing bodies, in part by referring to the artistic labour performed by Mitchell as the second Black dancer employed by the New York City Ballet. Her argument is grounded more broadly in her observation that Balanchine both incorporated what she terms Africanist movement principles, including displacement and off-centeredness, and invisibilized these principles' embeddedness in histories of Black sociality via the choreographic distortions of a Eurocentric lens. So that's Gottschall's powerful argument that stands. Gottschall's work has blazed a trail for further great scholarship by writers including Anthea Kraut, Claire Croft, and Tamara Tomic-Vajagic on the politics of whiteness in the work, and also in relation to Mitchell's own agency as a dancer of his self-determining Blackness in the pas de deux, all in the context of what Kraut has termed US theatre dance's history of white borrowing from racially subjugated communities. So that's the sort of existing scholarship on the question of race and racialization in this pas de deux. Viewed in this light, Argonne's wobbly work is no real departure from the imperial authority embedded in the historic classicisms he was versed in, but is an enactment of the authority afforded a white male European classical choreographer to encounter the off-balance idioms of Black dance vernaculars as a resource for his so-called invention of a New York ballet. What I'm interested in doing is digging a little deeper into the socio-economic beneath of this ballet, thinking beyond its representations and performance of race as identity to its reliance on another kind of racialized experience of spatial displacement. And this is not the displacement of the dancers themselves, but the removal of communities from the land on which they lived so that the New York City Ballet could take up residence at the New York State Theatre. Focusing on the ballet and that theatre's structural dependence on the material dispossession of racially devalued subjects, I read the wobbles of the pas de deux in relation to the rubble left upon Lincoln Square in the wake of a mass depopulation program spearheaded there by Robert Moses in the late 1950s. And I want to take a moment here to just kind of step out, but be sort of half in and half out, to note that the depopulation I describe here in Lincoln Square also underwrote the possibility of my own research that's informing this talk as a PhD researcher and junior scholar when I was undertaking primary research that became the book. The New York Public Library and the Performing Arts Division, where I spent weeks with Balanchine's archival materials, is located in the Lincoln Center development too. So I was in that site researching these histories of depopulation, that the library would not be located there without those histories. So a line to follow and account for reveals itself here, I think. And that's the mutual embeddedness of historical depopulation in that site and the cultures of economic distribution and international academic funding streams that afford some of us, me in this case, the chance to explore these histories in that same site. And these affordances are all mediated and determined, of course, by logics of racialized and classed entitlement and endowment. The arts and humanities funding streams themselves, inequitably distributed and cut and slashed, as colleagues at Huddersfield are experiencing now, as they are in the UK, are also not disconnected from broader global practices of spatial depopulation and dispossession. And I'm thinking again of contemporary movements across higher education and research, including several blocks north of Lincoln Center at the encampment at Columbia, campaigning for demilitarized university investments. So this is a sort of a digression that I hope is okay. And I'll go back to the story of Lincoln Square in just a moment, but I thought it was one worth pursuing slightly speculatively, momentarily, as there is, after all, no outside to the socioeconomic context we research. Researchers don't sit outside their projects all the problems with which we grapple. So in the light of the reality that arts projects and the research we might conduct into them are no more separate from their local and global entanglements than is the money that pays for these projects, it seems worth to me first reflecting on what afforded my own research journey in this project as being connected also with the socio-economic beneath of Balanchine's project that declared its democratic moves. So in relation to that small example of this sort of wobbling New York classicism and the histories of urban clearance underwriting them, I'm just going to move my attention to think about the aesthetic and economic co-implications of bodies that reside on unstable ground, and to think about a different kind of precarity, not one that's performed on stage, but one that is enforced to build the material conditions for that stage to exist. So back to Lincoln Square. And I think, yeah, maybe we can go to the next slide now, Colin, or the one that doesn't have dancers on it anymore. Yeah, great, thank you. So less than 1 week before Argon's premiere at the City Centre of Music and Drama in Manhattan's Midtown in December '57. So Argon premiered at a different theatre south of what would become Lincoln Center. But 1 week before its premiere, it's kind of a sort of periodizing move here. Robert Moses's Committee on Slum Clearance was authorized to embark on a program of what it termed urban renewal, a handful blocks northwest in Lincoln Square. Transplanting Midtown performing arts to a neighborhood known as San Juan Hill, a historic center of Black Bohemia, Lincoln Center would be constructed over the next decade as a complex of venues including the Philharmonic Hall, Metropolitan Opera House, and the New York State Theatre. As detailed by urban historian Samuel Zipp, the displacement of some of New York's most economically precarious residents was the ground from which New York's most notorious urban planner would seek to, and I quote Zipp, restore profitability to urban land. Lincoln Square, this is the sort of some of the technical legal parts of it. Lincoln Square had been lawfully designated by Moses in 1955 as a site fit for clearance via its sale to property developers, an act in turn that was authorized under Title I of the Federal Housing Act of 1949 and accelerated by Moses' personal harnessing of the act, so that so-called, and this is his term, rehabilitation of residents living in, again, his term, slums in Lincoln Square were abandoned in favor of full clearance and rebuilding to make way for an arts complex. So can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. Okay, so this is, yeah. Strong opposition, as you can see here, to the project was performed in public hearings and protests by Lincoln Square's inhabitants, thousands of working class and their allies, thousands of working class families, the majority earning beneath the city's median income, only 1% owning the properties they lived in, and a large minority of whom Puerto Rican and Black, who lived in an area the committee would characterize using a thinly veiled racist and classist term as an economic blight. And I want to emphasize here, just looking at this slide, the project of life and resistance, of reclaiming ground to live otherwise, that's enacted in these local protests, generating community-led political analytics, which are so often erased in favor of official records. But it's these community-led political analytics from which I'm ultimately drawing my understanding of these histories. And I'll come back to an example of one of those in a moment. Apart from the loss of hundreds of small businesses, these residents protested that they would be removed from their homes so that construction and the cultural centre could take their place. Their calls were ultimately overwhelmed by the voices of Lincoln Centre representatives, among them the project's president, John D. Rockefeller III, who at City Hall in September 57 insisted that the site held the potential for a truly great civic development. And that's the rhetoric with which Lincoln Centre was kind of announced and authorised and constructed. Within 2 years of the board's ruling, all residents have been relocated to overcrowded, segregated housing projects across Manhattan, their homes demolished and maps of the area redrawn. And so, the first steps of Lincoln Centre consisted in acts of social displacement, racialised population management, and cartographical erasure. In the archives in Lincoln Centre, in the Lincoln Centre's own archives of itself in Lincoln Centre, I was really taken by these little booklets that told the story of the birth of Lincoln Centre, and I'm going to share some photos, or a photo from them now, just to think a bit more about kind of rubble and wobble and precarity, and what that is replaced with in official narratives of kind of civic participation. So can we go to the next slide? Hopefully that's one of these. Yeah, okay. Oh, actually, that's from the New York Times. This shows the demolition itself. And the slide after that might hopefully be from the archive. Yeah, okay. So these are the images I was kind of interested in. So printed in the annual report for the first season of Lincoln Centre is this photograph taken August 62. An aerial shot shows the site nestled between Columbus and Amsterdam avenues in a state of incompletion. The Philharmonic Hall stands erected at the north side of the square here, looking a little like the Parthenon, and awaiting Lincoln Centre's formal opening a month later. And at this point, most of those venues had not yet been built, yet there was this commemorative booklet of their not yet builtness, which I find quite interesting. Apart from the broad open plaza at the centre, the rest of the site is taken up with structural foundations, building materials, debris, rubble, and temporary containers, items presenting not a reminder of buildings departed, but a promise of those to come. The photograph, in other words, offers the grand narrative of an architectural birth. This is a space of possibility, one whose history begins with these incipient constructions, and whose future will yield, as Wesley Jantz has called it, America's cultural acropolis. In presenting the construction site as the history of that location, the photograph, of course, also absents a very recent history, the destruction prefiguring the construction, and so too the histories of depopulation and resistance in that site. We might make sense of all of this by turning to Ngugi wa Thiong'o's discussion of theatre venues in post-colonial Kenya. Space as it's depicted in the context of official culture building can become conceived as something that Ngugi calls empty of history. And that's how I, through reading Ngugi, sort of came to understand these photographs, as they're presenting a space empty of history, a place of futures, from which the lives of its previous occupants have vanished. A bit more on this rhetoric, and then I'm going to turn to the anti-colonial analytic, born from the same space that cuts through it. But I did want to share a bit more. This is from Rockefeller, because I think it's interesting about sound as well. So I'm just going to share this. This rhetoric of democratic future building was articulated also in statements that Lincoln Centre's benefactors made, some of whom also tendered corporate patronage to Balanchine's company. In a speech delivered before the New York Board of Trade in October 57, Lincoln Center President John D. Rockefeller III outlined his vision for a co-generative relationship between the arts and American business. He delivered this speech just a few months before Argonne premiered at City Centre, and where that ballet was supported very directly by a large grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. So I look at Rockefeller because his family bankrolled the ballet that I'm interested in, and I think the way that he talks about this project is suggestive. So he says of Lincoln's, he says of the post-war arts and American business, as we attain cultural maturity. Actually, Colin, this might be a slide. Is this on the next slide, this quote from? Yeah, okay, good. As we attain cultural maturity, the arts are no longer the prerogative of the few. And this is sort of what I mean by like a declaration of a democratic vision that conceals its own violent underpinnings. They're now part of the fabric of the daily lives of all of us. Our free American society has given us the choice of how we may use our leisure. One may ask who this we is. Let us enrich the lives of people everywhere with the form and the movement, the colour and gesture, the rhythm and song of the arts. A part of his discourse on corporate citizenship, and he cited Lincoln Square in this same speech as an exemplar of this vision, his appeal to the hearts, but more specifically the pockets of New York businessmen, is qualified by the fact that just 1 month before delivering this speech, he had heard public arguments from the Square's residents about their proposed relocation under the banner of slum clearance. Clearly, this cultural centre would not become part of the fabric of the daily lives of all, when its very construction necessitated the removal of certain populations from their daily lives in that site. And the gesture and song that Rockefeller, you can almost read him hearing this, rushing around, gesture and song rushing around Lincoln Center and Lincoln Square, is only afforded by the elimination of the gesture, song, practices of living together that predated the development project and belonged to those for whom that site was already a home. Can we move on to the next slide that's blank? Yeah. Okay, those voices are not silenced, though. The analytical work of local housing activists who were members of those targeted communities provides us here with a frame for seeing the violent ground underpinning this cultural vision. Aramis Gomez of the Puerto Rican Citizens Housing Committee, a local activist who stood against the urban renewal project spearheaded by Moses, put it succinctly when he explained in 1962 that this housing program overall seems to vision a New York without Puerto Ricans. That was his pushback. By illuminating Lincoln Center as a state-sponsored campaign of racial clearance, Gomez offers what I think is a really important anti-colonial analytic that might cut through the rhetoric developed by the agents of the Lincoln Square development. This political elite, of course, concealed the racial geographics of their urban renewal inside a liberal discourse of corporate citizenry, where sound, gesture, rhythm, and colour is available to all. And that discourse is couched in turn in the patronage of architectural works like Lincoln Center and balletic works like Argonne. In her theorization of dance patronage and the immiserating dynamics of capitalist this is a quote from Olive McCohen, and it's her theorization of dance patronage and the immiserating dynamics of capitalist generosity. That's her words, which I think are pointed and apt here. Olive McCohen proposes that we should pay attention to the connections between concert dance, capital accumulation, and land struggles. These connections at Lincoln Center are situated categorically by Gomez in Histories of Racialized Urban Depopulation and Community Struggle. It's through the activist analytic of figures like Gomez, ultimately, that these histories of depopulation and of resistance are unburied, unearthed, and assert themselves vocally as grounds for thinking and living otherwise. So return now to Balanchine briefly before closing to kind of tie these different threads of thinking and research together. The histories of dispossession, precarity, and also their resistance appear beneath the artistic instabilities of Balanchine's work. I argue only when we're attentive to the history of the land on which the company danced when performing the wobbles of Argonne at their regular playing space, a place once covered by the rubble of demolished homes. The great critic Arlene Crotchy has joined several dance critics in viewing Argonne as an embodiment of New York City itself. And I find this really interesting. A lot of dance critics speak about this work as being like the city of New York. And she says, I've always thought that Argonne drew its personality from the city it was made in. The disconcerting eruptions in the choreography match the hectic behavior of city streets. Close quote. So as much as I appreciate Crotchy's kind of apt and quite profound sense of this work, it seems important to think about Balanchine's reinvention of ballet in relation to the city of its birth, beyond its kind of metaphoric incorporation of the energies of the streets. It's a sort of romanticizing idea. Balanchine's choreographic sanction of bodily instability takes on a more fraught set of associations when viewed in the light of a local history of urban depopulation and housing activism. By presenting a tightly wound, decentered and trembling classicism to an audience poised to take part in an exercise of democratic culture building, Balanchine did more than reinvent the spatial customs of his field. He also acquired as the literal foundation to his unsteady ballets a plot of land whose histories of displacement had been disposed of in the material and discursive construction of Lincoln Center as a place that's somehow both for all Americans, as Rockefeller puts it, and, to recall Gomez, without Puerto Ricans. All right, to conclude now, I'm just going to skip a little bit to the end. To conclude now, I want to propose that when Balanchine choreographs an edgy ballet pas de deux, and specifically choreographs it for a Black man and a white woman in the 50s, this dance actually does something less progressive than many have suggested, which is that it engages with the broader national agitations of the burgeoning civil rights movement via its interracial casting. That has been suggested by several. And I think it does do that, but it also does something less progressive. Viewed through the frame proposed by Puerto Rican activists working to resist Moses and Rockefeller's space acquisition project, it's clear that, that the democracy of Balanchine's ballet also bolstered the settler and corporate imaginaries with which the New York business, political and cultural elite laid claim to the land of the city. This is not, what, do I want to say this bit? No, I'm going to skip to the final bit. And then if there's more, we'll talk about it, because I think I've been talking for too long. But I just want to say this one final thing, which is zooming out a little bit from the Balanchine example and thinking more broadly again about the commitments and responsibilities of wanting to tell these sorts of stories about these dance works. And I want to think about dance, critique and hope and what I'm trying to do here. And I'm not sure if I'm achieving it, but it's something that is something that's my aim anyway. when I was writing the conclusion to the book, which is a series of examples like this that takes pretty well established, some of which much more experimental and progressive dance examples that are heralded as forms of kind of like socially liberatory in some way experiments in the Euro-American canon. The book takes various examples of those and seeks the material, violent ground underpinning them in the way that I've just done. And so by the time I was writing the conclusion to the book, I wondered if I was just being an ethically and politically unjustifiable misery guts, actually. And if I was painting an unacceptably fatalistic picture. But I still did that. And here's why. This is the impetus that was driving this research. I mean, what I'm kind of thinking about is the critical negativity that I propose here. I really mean it to reach beyond what Jose Munoz has termed a disabling political pessimism. And I said this earlier, but I think it's worth repeating. And instead to pursue a practice of possibility that's drawn out by activist thinkers, including Paulo Freire, from whom I borrow now in closing. As Freire writes of pedagogies of revolutionary hope when they're released from more dubious liberal utopianisms. And he says, a deepened consciousness of their situation leads people to apprehend that situation as a historical reality susceptible of transformation. So to take up Freire's formulation for my own much more narrow and modest field here, a deepened consciousness of Euro-American theatre dance as a material situation built on racialized dispossession and racialized struggle invites us to apprehend it not as a political dead end, but as a historical reality susceptible of and requiring transformation. And that's a small possibility I wanted to practice with this book in coalition with projects like Linda Tabar's that I cited at the beginning of this talk. Tabar's work that seeks to record and document in the face of eliminationist projects, social movements which claim the ground to live otherwise. I wanted to suggest that it's not inevitable that the conditions of violence remain concealed, unchallenged, preventing the seeking out of grounds to live otherwise beneath liberal dance utopianisms. So long as that dance is viewed with a critical attention, permitting us to look through its moving claims that we might be moved by, and I indeed have been very moved by, but looking through those moving claims to the ground on which it moves. And that's the end. I'm finished now. And sorry, that was long.
Thank you. No, not at all.
Mm.
Do we want to have a little break so people can stretch their legs? Or should we just get straight to it?
I mean, I was just moving around a bit when I had my camera off, so I feel like I'm fine. Ben, what do you think? Should we just go ahead? Or?
I have so much that I want to say, but I can hold it back if we want to take a break. I follow your structure.
All right. I think we can just go for it, and people feel, because most people have the cameras off, obviously, you know, feel free to just do something else for a couple of minutes, or if you want to walk. I mean, I think it's fine. We can go.
Is that okay for you, Arabella? I mean, do you want a little break?
No, that's fine for me to keep going. Yeah, and then maybe we can finish early so people can go and have their dinner.
Do you want to dive in, Ben, then? And
I would love to. May I? Yeah. I mean, because this is very close to my heart, what you've presented. And I actually, I mean, having read your book several months ago, I have questions that I wanted to ask you from reading your book. And some of them you've kind of answered or started to answer in the presentation. And then, I mean, you're absolutely right. We're experiencing at Huddersfield a sort of very small mini version of, but a lot of the structures and the rhetorics are the same, of a kind of clearing of ground with this kind of violent positivity, where there's like an announcement of research excellence, teaching excellence, this kind of celebratory of what the future is on this large scale. And then underneath it is all of this clearing away of what's considered not worthy, not valuable, in order to build that other world that's supposedly going to be so innovative and dynamic. So it really, that's resonating a lot. For that reason, I'm also totally exhausted, or as they say, shattered here. So I hope that I'll be coherent. But I do really want to ask, I think the things I want to ask you are big questions that probably will not be really even sufficiently asked today by me, let alone engaged with. But I want to put them out there. And some of them have to do with some conversations that also have come up in the previous, a couple of the previous sessions. And yeah, actually, maybe because we had said that we would have a little conversation with the three of us. So I'm going to allow myself to speak a little bit more than I normally would. Normally, I would, contain myself to a concise question. But I do want to kind of respond and take a little bit more space maybe in this particular moment. There was something that was shared on social media, which I think I sent to Sophie, perhaps, or we talked about it, because we had been talking about John Cage, in a previous session. And I think, one thing that is coming up in these sessions is a certain generation that we are in relation to. They were talking about Cage. You're talking about Balanchine. You've also written about Cunningham, for example, in the same book. Those aren't the figures that have expertise in, but I write a lot about Grotowski, who in some way is also in that generation, and this kind of moment of this articulation of some kind of freedom that is also massively limited and even built on violence in a lot of ways. And like, what do we do with that? And why are we still referring to those moments of the 60s and 70s, but I think we have to still refer to them somehow. We're compelled to refer to them. And there was something on social media that was shared exactly about, I think it was at Columbia, but somewhere in New York, with probably at Columbia, where they actually published this, that they said, I couldn't teach Cage, right? I couldn't teach Cage's 4 minutes, 33 seconds, because in the silence, there was the sound of the protests. And it shouldn't be that. It should be kind of quiet, maybe some bird sounds, some people talking. And of course, many people responded by saying, that's one way of interpreting that piece of work. One could also interpret that piece of work came and said to you, listen to the protests, and you shut down the protests by shutting down that piece of work. So, to me, what that speaks to is a massive ambiguity that is in these works. And I feel that really deeply when you're talking about the wobble. I feel like I can and again, Balanchine, I'm not an expert in Balanchine, so I'm not at all trying to make a claim about which side of the wobble it falls onto, but I can absolutely hear you. That's a staging of instability. That's an appropriation of Africanist movement. Yes, but I also it's a wobble in classical ballet. So for someone who's not trained in classical ballet, it's like you made classical ballet wobble. That's deconstruction. That's there is a radical impulse in that, which, and I think you are also acknowledging that. And so all of this says to me, I come to the same place, which is where you ended, which is kind of like dance. You said dance critique and hope. And I immediately wrote down dance critique and practice. And then you immediately said practice. This word practice is very important to me because so you and I are also publishing siblings now, because I published with Northwestern, and my book that just came out, it talks about the relationships of technique, identity, and place. And place is something that I came to later in the process. So the kind of the main thrust of the book is about the relations between technique and identity, and how to avoid, on the one hand, a sort of, but this is very resonant, I think, with what you're presenting, how to avoid, on the one hand, a kind of escapist and intentionally or unintentionally violent liberal imaginary, in which identity dissolves into technique, because technique is freedom and we don't have to worry about identity, on the other hand. But also what I take to be the kind of the kind of paralyzing pessimism that you're referring to, where identity is the real thing, technique is effectively an illusion. And so there can nothing that we can do at the level of technique or knowledge or transformation can impact identity. There's no traffic between the levels. And so I'm trying to look at that. Yes, there is traffic between those levels. And then relatively late in that research process, I understood that it's technique, identity, and place. And this is, of course, exactly what you're bringing to attention, that beneath identity in some way is place. But by the same token, you know, it's not the case that identity is also kind of illusory or small in relation to the reality of place. They are in conversation. The meaning of the place comes from the identity, just as the meaning of the identity comes from the place. And like the meaning of New York City has an identity, you know, so this kind of complexity. And I'm looking at that in that book in the context of artistic research and practice research. And for me, that's super important because I think, you know, when you were saying, I mean, I start from this acknowledgement that you very much made about like our institutional positions are really no different. I mean, you know, here I am in a British university. I'm traveling into the British university on a pathway of whiteness from the US. I'm making use of these colonial legacy wealth to do this research. I don't have any, you know, I'm not on any higher ground to say to a historical or a contemporary practitioner, you know, look, you're building on this colonial legacy, because I'm in the same colonial legacy in some way. Now, we all have different positions in relation to that, but this kind of challenge to this kind of, I guess it's like I mean, I'm landing on a kind of constitutive ambiguity, but I don't really want to land on ambiguity. It's more about the details. It's more about like, because what I find as, you know, for example, trying to launch a research center. Now, the research center is meant to do something that's different from what academia normally does, but it can't be that different, because if it's that different, it can't be launched at all. You know, you can't even get there. So to get there, you have to be doing a lot of what's expected, but then you can do some things that are unexpected. And then you find suddenly that you're very precarious and everything is going to be shut down anyway, because what you did was even that little bit of experimentation was actually too much to be sustainable. And it just, you know, it feels like such a focused kind of delicate question, which hinges upon, you know, is the wobble an appropriation, or is it a radical intervention? Is it a transmission of knowledge that changes something? Is the research a kind of co-opting or a gathering or a dominating of something, or is it a meaningful act? Because we all get turned into the alibi. Like, as soon as we do something that for us is authentic, and it's like, look, you know, we said this thing or we did this thing, it can immediately be branded and made into that I'm using your word alibi because it's quite a powerful word, to feel that, you know, your work that you dedicated decades to, and that you actually believe it on a substantive level, is also functioning as someone else's alibi. And you know, those are both true on different levels. So I guess, I mean, I'm really with these kind of questions as a practical question, and I feel like my question, which is obviously unanswerable in the broad sense, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it, is like, when we think about practice, when we think about, I mean practice on different levels, but first of all, the structuring of research, the kind of research we do, the kind of research center we have, like, what is a university? But also, I also mean movement, right? Because I also feel this kind of sense of like, if I really go into, you know, if my ultimate need is to be sufficiently critical, then I won't be moving anymore. You know, I won't be moving or singing. And there, you know, so there needs to be ways to continue, like the moving and singing is also knowledge. So how do we, I guess I'm, like, shifting from hope to practice, like, how does this critique, this historical and decolonial and anti-colonial critique, what does it tell us, or what do we do with it, or how do you see it in practical terms in relation to both the structures of research in the university, to dance practice, I mean, really, I'm invested in practice research because I think that practice research, artistic research, is this question. That's what I actually think it is. It's this question about, like, if you apply your critical knowledge, you need to completely change the whole structure, but you also are not simply protesting it. You're right. You're, and I don't mean to simplify that, because I think the protests are absolutely practice research, but they're not all of practice research, because they raise certain questions like, let's have a different kind of university, but then you also need to actually make another kind of university.
Ben, it's so amazing. Thank you. Oh, okay. So there's basically, I want to respond to all of that, but I'm way too tired to do it. So we're going to have like a lifelong conversation, because that was all, yeah. All of that is pointing to questions that I have. But I think maybe some of them weren't so pronounced when I was writing the book, but I really have a lot of since I finished writing it, and have had some distance from it. So I really appreciate all of it. Maybe what I'll do is give like a tiny partial answer to the final part when you posed the question, and something that was coming to mind. The big question is, what do you do? What does one do with research like this? Actually, can I give you a small confession to explain why this? I really appreciate the question. When I first published the book, I know that some artists that I've been in conversation with read it, and one of those people wrote to me and said that it resonated with them, and they wanted to know and to talk about how to develop their dance practice, how to practice that practice of how to practice an anti-colonial spatial analytic through dance. And did I have any ideas about that? And this is my confession. I was like, no, I don't. I was not ready for that question, and I felt quite bamboozled by it. And what I really wanted to say was, I'm not here to tell you how to practice your practice. And what they were asking for was a dialogue and a conversation about it. And I think that's the answer, is to meet in a conversation. But yeah, I'll just start with that to say, when I was asked that question by a practitioner I really respect, who I'm already in dialogue with, it took the breath out of me, because quite honestly, I was not writing the book with the thought that any artist would find that book useful or provocative. But I feel slightly differently about it now, because when you put something into the world, and I do believe in a lot of the things I said in the book, like it comes with a commitment to follow it through and figure out where it could go and how it could get taken up and pushed back against and reformulated. And if that can be done by artists, then that's totally amazing. So it actually reminds me I need to follow up with this person. But then a small tiny answer about like what to do, maybe, yeah, the what to do things. I was just thinking about, yeah, the wobble as something that does its own artistic work, that has its own artistic value. It destabilizes ballet histories. It puts dancers in dynamic motion. It certainly like rescued me from my glum, like tiny femininity as a teenage ballet dancer. I was like, I can be big, I can be dynamic, I can fall over, I can wobble. That's a personal response, but yeah, Ben, I agree with you that the wobble does its own artistic work, and how to bring that towards the realities of social struggle that sit around and underneath the theatre in which that wobble is produced. I was just thinking, like, actually, what would it be like if those dancers who are workers as well, and this happens all the time, join the communities who are protesting the construction of the theatre? Like, so that's one very simple thing, is that artists are workers and are people who also, through their lives in and outside of the theatre, participate in social struggles. And the artwork might not need to do that in a dogmatic way, but the art people can. So that's maybe just a small that's a small thought, but that it's also transposes, and again, this is very honest, I don't think it's a particularly like illuminating answer, but I do think for me as a researcher, thinking less about artists and now thinking about researchers, which was the other side of your question, for me it would make absolutely no sense at all to do this kind of work as an academic, publish it, and then just go about my day in the institution. So what it does, what it can do for me personally, is it's helped me see reading anti-colonial scholars, reading Indigenous thought, engaging with these, as TaPRA said, radical traditions that contribute to claiming the ground for living otherwise. It's helped me see my institution differently. It's helped me see my living conditions differently. And it motivates me to participate in collective action in my workplace and outside my workplace. So I see the research work as connected to the activist, and I use that very modest activist work. That's the only thought I think I can articulate in response to your brilliant musings right now.
I think there's a lot in there. In particular, because of the way that we can maybe start to think about technique and identity, and technique as knowledge that is part of one's identity. And in the example you gave of like, what about if the dancers went to visit the protesters? Because what happens there, of course, is like there are, the dancers aren't just dancers. There are also people who are members of different communities who live in houses too, and who have some sense of what it would mean to have to leave their homes. And so there are all of these, there's all of this overlap that can begin to transform, the other parts that the dancer might consider as separate. And of course, that considering separate is like a very firm basis, of kind of canonical Western institutional and performance training, that you have a very strict separation between who you are as a performer, as an artist, and who you are as a person. And that is something I experienced a lot, very much in music, with, to the point that it was suffocating, that it was really like there was a huge part of me that was just dying and I wasn't noticing it, because of the way that certain aspects of our technical beings, because we're technical beings in all kinds of ways beyond like the repertoire that we train in, or the performance techniques that we study. But there's a way that those performance techniques are kind of, there are these homologies, and he's what Anna Bull calls them in her book, Class Control and Classical Music, between technique and virtue, basically, and technical development and status and all that. So this is maybe a bit of a digression, but that's one of the ways in which that separation occurs, right? Because you start to overvalue or value in a particular way certain capacities of your body over others, and that then makes you see yourself increasingly as the dancer, making it harder and harder to find the other areas of overlap. And then I was thinking about what that has to do with like the question of, okay, well then what is it to what did I write in my notes, to do this artistic research, or this transformation, or this intervention, or this reimagination? Like, what does that actually look like? And I totally resonate with your just like, I don't know, because which is it's probably just another layer of this separatedness, right?
Yeah, that's true.
But also then I was thinking about the ways in which maybe, because you were talking, I was really compelled by the way you talked about cartographic erasure, and when you said maps of the area redrawn, I was like, what? Because you think, how is that a place is a place? How can you redraw a map? But of course you can redraw a map, and maps are redrawn all the time on the level of towns and cities, and also of continents. And then I was thinking that in relation to the newness and the rhetoric of the the Rockefeller Center, and this idea of cultural maturity as well. Like now we've reached this, and history begins here, and the real stuff is going to happen here. And I was thinking about that in relation to, like, I guess sort of 20th century avant-garde, but maybe also more historical as well, developments where we fetishize newness, or where we are very excited about newness in whatever kind of arts practice, and it's really seen as whatever the engine that drives the whole thing forward. And I was actually thinking about that in relation to this raising of the territory and clearing of the ground. And my own experience of, traditional music, which I have various connections with, partly where I'm from, the Eastern Mediterranean, the models are very different. So what you contribute as an individual is always a kind of new, is like almost semi-improvised configuration of lots of parts, right? The parts are always there in circulation, going around different bodies, as in the technical parts, like this, when it comes to dance. So like the options of movement that are available to you, or song when it's turns and improvisations, and how you inflect words and things like that. And so I'm thinking, I always have that in mind as like, it's this fetishization of newness is not, we don't have to like give into that. And then I'm thinking of this transformation of these practices as just very contrary actually to that kind of new. It's actually the opposite. It's going back. Like, oh, I trained for so many years and then I dropped out, or I quit, or whatever, and then I wrote this book, and then it's like, yeah, and then you have to go right back to the very beginning. And this is kind of how I feel about my own classical vocal training as well, that I just sometimes I have this, yeah, so it's a kind of horizon for me, like what would it mean to go back to that and to unpick all of it, to go back to it in a way that I'm not trying to reproduce it, I'm not trying to be good, I'm not trying to reach that level where I can comfortably conflate my technical abilities with my social status or whatever, or my inherent goodness, where I'm actually breaking it apart piece by piece. And there is like, there's newness there too, but it's a very different kind of newness. And it's much more fine-grained, much more coarse, and also personal, because you said, that you had that personal anecdote, and I think that's really key, actually. That's really key, that we bring all of that history, because again, that's exactly what we're trying to restore, right? That continuity. And I just, okay, so to end that thought, I shared something with Ben the other day that it's funny, we're rehearsing our Facebook Messenger conversations. I sent something to Ben the other day of Fred Moten's that I just want to briefly read. He's talking about Eliot, T.S. Eliot, and he gave a lecture, the T.S. Eliot Memorial Lecture. And he started, of course, by talking about what does it mean that I'm here under the name of Eliot. And he said a lot of things. I just cut this little bit of it. Part of what it means to be a Black student is always to confront the horrible fact of needing something sometimes from people who you desperately don't want to need anything from. And I needed something from Eliot. I needed that sound. I needed the way he thinks. I needed his brilliance. I needed it against his grain. I needed to be able to deploy it against him. And in a weird way, I needed to be able to deploy it against him on his behalf, insofar as always what it showed was that there was something in him that needed to be salvaged, something in him that needed to be saved. So I'm not ambivalent about being here in honor of Eliot. I'm happy to be here in honor of the inexplicable mystery of Eliot's sound against the grain of the rather more brutal and utterly explicable non-mysteries some of the stuff he says.
Wow.
Which I think
That's
kind of it's very like razor sharp.
Yeah, it's great. It reminds me, whilst you've been talking about newness and the conundrum of resisting newness as like the province or the declaration of white avant-garde movements, whilst also wanting to resist a kind of like maybe slightly eugenicist return to classical form or something or other. It's interesting you went to Moten. That's so great. I will look at that in the chat. But I was thinking about Trajal Harrell's work, the choreographer Trajal Harrell, who specifically a kind of a series of works that he did a few years ago. They have different names, but one of the kind of headline ones is Paris is Burning at Judson Church. And he's doing a really interesting archaeology of his legacies. I'm trying to remember the Moten thing of what is it on his behalf? What was that thing about Eliot?
To deploy it against him on his behalf.
Okay,
yeah.
To deploy it against him on his
deploy
behalf.
his brilliance against him on his behalf.
Yeah. So that's really brilliant, and it makes me think of Trajal Harrell's work with this series of works where he made them from the initiating conceit. What would happen if the dancers from Judson Dance Theatre in downtown Manhattan met with the dancers from Vogue ballroom scenes in Harlem, uptown Manhattan? What would happen if they met and the work started from there? And so there's some kind of, especially the inheritance of the utterly new Judson Dance Theatre experimentalist tradition of the 60s. I think that through that work, Harrell is doing something that Moten said that he's doing with Eliot somehow. Yeah, it's helping me make sense of his practice also. It's like a good model of how to deal with history and how to deal with histories that you might need to deploy against themselves on their behalf.
Could you put that name in the chat? Thanks.
Trajal Harrell. What I'm going to do is just put this link, and then this is a link to a small bit of information about one of those works, and then anybody who wants to can go and investigate the whole website.
Great, thanks. Would anybody like to, we have just one little comment, feel free to just ask either with your microphone or camera or in the chat if you have any questions or comments.
Hi friends, thank you so much for this. It's SJ. I maybe because this conversation feels so familiar and like deeply personal, and it sounds like all of us, and I mean, I think there's something particular about those of us who use our bodies as instruments also, and that attachment to our identity of like the body's, you know, role in identity, and how when we become part of these worlds, these architectures that are kind of inescapably oppressive in their nature, just clearing populations for their, you know, entitlement and you know, and as we are, you know, these soft and impressionable parts of us are rewarded by these institutions when we are experiencing something that is so vital and visceral and primal in us. I think something changes, and I I mean, as I continue to peel these, layers of kind of colonial indoctrination that have, dampened my senses and sense of self, I feel compelled to learn to navigate the landscape differently, because I feel as soon as we start to, in this message of hope, and this we need to analyze where we have been and where we are in order to dream of new worlds, and I think that's really, really important. And I mean, I was just about to head into a PhD to once again enter the oppressor's arena to convince it was oppressive, like so many of us do, trying to reconcile a relationship with the music that lives inside of that space, or the learning, the knowing that can live inside of that space, but is so often, again, Ben, as you were talking about, very limited and very bridled. Like, it just feels like, as much as, we can be proficient, if we're not connecting, we're tools, and because our bodies are ourselves, I think that becomes irreconcilable at a certain point for those of us who feel and empathize with the world around us. In dreaming of these new worlds and new methodologies, new ways of engaging with our craft and with music that has relevance and that does have things to teach us, and that that we can deploy in that active way. How, what spaces do you dream of? I mean, I ask this to all three of you. Again, this kind of, I have this deep reluctance to build. I want to learn how to be with. It feels really, and I think all of us have this impulse. I think we're all searching for that, and I hear it through all of this series. I feel very, very lucky to get to listen in on these conversations, and because it does feel like there is great solidarity in this desire for hope. I think so many of us are still stuck in that place where, we're bridled by our institutions, or, capitalism. Late stage capitalism is not friendly to freelancers as artists, and the safety of the institution is very seductive. What do you dream the new landscape would look like? How do we return to a place where we can access that primal relationship without feeling owned?
I think I'll just give a brief response. I think thank you for those thoughts. There are thoughts that have occupied me, troubled me a lot over the years, and still do. And I'm currently in a very sort of temporary, safe institutional place because it's a short-term thing. But feel its impact on me, very, very palpably, having also lived as a freelance artist for a long time and done a PhD, which was semi-precarious. And I obviously don't have an answer because that would be amazing. I think that one of the things I do return to, and I referred to traditional music, for lack of a better term before, that's a place for me where I don't feel owned, right? And that's precisely because of the kind of dynamic relationship between technique and identity that exists in those spaces. And I mean places where people dance, traditional dances, and that is not happening as a pantomime, but it's happening as a life event, or where traditional songs are sung, again, not as theater but as ceremony. And those places for me are models. They're not they're models of being with, as you say, right, rather than of building. And so I kind of look for that quality in collaborations, or in places that in kind of ways of working that are not entirely captured by a system. Places where the desire to be with somebody and with their way of thinking, and to be touched by that, is irresistible. And yeah, we probably are going to apply for funding at some point to extend this, but like, whatever, let's be in the same room. I want to like see how you do that thing, and then the question is always how to live in that and not in all the rest of it. Yeah.
I'll say something and then we can give it to Arabella as well. But it's a really great question. I think on some level it's like a very personal question. So it's very hard because it's a very practical question. So it's, but I don't feel like I want to say, okay, well, this particular thing. And like, how am I thinking about, so the idea, the framework of technique, identity, and place is how I've tried to articulate something that I think is a little bit beyond just the personal of like, the kinds of things, the kinds of places that I have found. And I think, as I said before, place is not really connected yet for me in some way. That's because I'm diasporic, and I'm someone who comes from a family that fairly recently left Europe to escape genocide and then ended up in this US thing and then is back in Europe somehow. So I'm a bit floating, and I don't feel I've landed, and that's been made very clear very recently that I definitely have not landed. So I'm looking for my place. But what I will say is that there's an excavation process that feel like I've been undertaking for maybe my whole life, or like 20 years or some long period, about understanding the relations between technique and identity, where I feel like many parts of my identity were not, they were just, it's disconnected. It's like we are these things, these identities, but somehow they have nothing to do with what we do, because we're going to live in this world of sort of pure technique, pure action. And it's, everything is like, what kind of job are you going to have? And what's your discipline going to be? And all of those things, as if that's just disconnected from identity. But I mean, as a diasporic subject, like I want to speak to, it's not disconnected from identity, like, all of those choices that I now, and so try like getting those things to speak to each other and to be like, like, for example, I'll just take one example, is like, okay, writing. Oh, I've always been good at writing. Ben's good at writing. What does that mean? Wait, there's different kinds of writing. Wait a minute. There's a certain kind of writing that is this kind of dominating, logocentric, totalizing, taxonomizing writing. You know what? I'm going to call that white writing. And I started to call it white writing in my recent thing. That does something for me. Like, that's just white writing. That's not all of writing. There's other kinds of writing. And you know what another kind of writing is? I'm going to call it diasporic Jewish writing. That's a totally different kind of writing. It's related to critical theory. I'm going to call critical theory Jewish, which, and people used to say psychoanalysis is Jewish, Marxism is Jewish. They don't say that anymore. These things have been disconnected. But wait, who's doing the critical theory that I find most at home at the moment? It's Black Studies. Black Studies is the place that I feel like I can live again when I'm reading. I mean, I'm in an institutional situation that's toxic. I go home and I read Black Studies and I can breathe. And it's like those reattachments of study and knowledge and technique and these kinds of things that have, it's all of this violent act that cuts that off from long histories of identity, which are also the histories of people traveling from places to other places. when those things are reconnected in a meaningful way, which is a practical project that takes decades or centuries, but like that for me is this kind of idea of a reconnection that's like, you don't even have to, it's not that white writing is bad, it's just like it's colonizing and destroying the planet. So it needs to be, it needs to be reined in, it needs to be stopped, it needs to be balanced, but we don't have to throw it in the trash. But we need to know, we need to re-articulate these relations, which I call technique, identity, and place. Obviously, other terms could be used, but these kind of different historical layers. To me, that's the possibility of a work that kind of, because when I think in those terms, it like, it somehow puts me outside of the institution, because I'm like, oh, that's just your institutional form. That's just what you think a university should be. There's been many other kinds of universities and knowledge flows, many other relations between technique, identity, and place than this kind of building that you think you need to build. So there is some possibility there, I think.
I think I can say something as well, maybe. Well, first of all, just thinking about the institution as a place that offers safety and security, that's the academic institution. That's clearly not the case, is it? Or at least it's the case for some of us and not for others. And the way in which we see this by the way in which people exit the university. People are forced out through redundancies, but also, I know where I work, and I hope it's okay to share this. I don't know who I'm asking myself really, that there are several Black and brown women in particular who've left the university because they have to, because that's not a safe and secure place. That's another kind of ejection that's not a redundancy, but it's also an ejection via the violent racializing mechanisms of the institution. So is that a place of safety for whom? No, but then thinking slightly more hopefully in response to this beautiful question of, I think, where do you dream? I don't know, but it made me think of this thing that happened a few years ago. One of the many times we being UK-based academics have been on strike recently. I was on one of the strikes, and we had a workshop, like a teach out workshop that student activists led, that was about reimagining the university, and everybody had to go with these big pieces of paper. I'm sure everybody's done something like this, and like, draw your dream university. And we were doing it in groups, like mixtures of staff and students, and it was really wonderful. But I was with a group of students, and we were drawing our dream university, and they had all these like very utopian things on there, like utopian in different registers, like a swimming pool, yes, ice cream van, yes, but then serious things as well, like evacuate management from that building, restructure, there is no management, restructure, like, so it's like some serious political thinking, and then dreaming ice cream. But it was all very like utopian. And then there was this student very quietly just like scribbling in the corner, and when we'd all finished, we could all see what they had written, and they just written, it wasn't in like nice colors or whatever. I work at Sussex, which is very kind of like 60s, think of the future, kind of nice colors, ice cream, radically democratic structure, like it was all nice. But the student had put in the corner, in kind of jagged, simple writing, political struggle. And it was sort of like this, like, boom. I don't know what that is. It kind of dropped the mic on the paper version of a dropping the mic. And it wasn't working against the ice cream and the get rid of management, but it was a necessary part of that utopianism. And that's why I was mentioned Freire at the end of my talk, because his is a revolutionary utopianism, rather than not one in which we can all feel happy together, but one which is forged through political struggle. So maybe that would be the space I dream of. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
just before it's 7 minutes to, just before we wrap up, Astrid, do you want to ask your question? Sorry, there's such little time.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been brilliant. I feel really excited. I guess I'll just try and briefly just describe the context that I'm in, and just like a quick question at the end, which is basically a yes or no, or hopefully short. Yeah, the question of what is it anti-colonial therapy practice look like? Thank you for that question, because that is very pertinent to me right now. I was for me, it's what does a anti-colonial dance therapy practice look like? Because that's what I was trained in. I'm African Caribbean from part of my one side of the family is from Sierra Leone, the other from Bermuda, so steeped in colonialism, and we are still a colony of Britain. And in terms of music and dance have been very central. I started out as a classical violinist. I didn't know that music of Black origin was possible for me at the time. For example, jazz. My parents were they were both classical music lovers. My mother was classically trained as well, so it was that whole world that I didn't know that I had access to. And jumped a few decades later, I did a dance therapy training at Roehampton, and I know you have some ties to that, Arabella. And so this, in terms of the registration as a therapist, the structures of legitimacy, as I call them, required that, the scholarship include, mental pathology, Eurocentric ideas of healing, that people themselves are problems, leaving out social context, systems, impact on people, especially those who are marginalized. And, of course, we had to study classic Laban movement analysis, which was never in the service of describing other than white bodies, because it was centering of white bodies and how they move. So, I have to give credit to the tutors, because they didn't emphasize, Laban as much as, say, the dance therapy program at the Laban Center as it existed then, but actually introduced, thankfully, some postmodern ideas like social constructionism and, the identities are formed in relation to others and in conversation, whether it's verbal or movement or in other ways. So really that kept me alive and in the work, because it provided me a space to later question, that pathology, what does that mean? How I pathologize myself and others that I worked with. So, but, unfortunately, I was already colonized by that point. And so, during that training, there wasn't a sense that that this training doesn't represent my body or how I move or my culture or history. So there was a lot of gaps that, that I had to fill. I left the profession, and, such as like, my bodily knowing of ancestral movement, and, what does that mean for other bodies of color I was working with. So, at the moment, that's like really central to how I want my work to be shaped now. So, so that's sort of my, now I'm sort of going back to the institution, to academia, and sort of learning something called the narrative worldview, which is based on the idea that problems are manufactured in social, cultural, and political context, and that change occurs largely by exploring how language is used to create and maintain problems. So, interrogating dominant discourses, how problems take shape in systems, deconstructing power and knowledge, celebrating people's local knowledges, working collectively with communities of struggle, which kind of, links with activism. So, unfortunately, I'm in an institution that is, kind of a microcosm of decolonizing learning and practice, and they're still decolonizing, and they have a willingness to, decolonize the plane as they fly it, as it were. And so, if you want to incorporate Black feminism, we can, anything that's, sort of politically relevant. So I feel quite lucky about that. So anyway, my question actually is very different. It's about the land's possession and displacement, and the precarity of communities, in service of building the Lincoln Center, like, and the phrase a space empty of history was really struck me. And what that brought to mind was the numerous non-white and particularly Black performers that have performed this since. And, are they aware of this history, and particularly sort of Jalco, the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, because, what they play is, their music is uniquely African American. And so it has a history of Black American struggle and resistance. So, that's quite antithetical to sort of all the things that we've been discussing today. So yeah, I just wondered if you have any knowledge of, if there's any reparative, anyone is voicing this, speaking about it, of any reparative processes or anything. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Astrid. That's such an amazing question, and bringing us to kind of end the session by thinking about reparative practice and reparation as well is so appreciated. And also thank you for sharing your context too. Really appreciated hearing that, and I'm excited for you for the space you're in now also. My very quick answer is I don't know to your question. I'm sorry, it's very disappointing. I don't know. My focus for this research, it sort of ended in 1964. And I love your question because now I'm going to go and find out. Because I feel like it's important to find out, and I think it's important to not find out as well, because I think, yeah, like I was saying throughout, I don't think it can be the end point to name and recognize violence. I think that has to be as part of a kind of radical coalitional reparative process in which artists are involved. And so there must be, but I don't know. Maybe, do others know? Contemporary Lincoln Center praxis that deals with those histories?
I don't, but I just thought of this, which is an opera about gentrification in Portland. I mean, it's a different part of the country, but it might be of interest methodologically, or I'm just sharing that in the chat. It's quite interesting. It's very many parallels,
Cool.
just in another situation.
Yeah, thank you for that amazing
Yeah.
question. It's one of those questions that kind of instigates a new, not a new, but a next exploration, and a necessary one.
I wonder if these things are specifically about gentrification and dispossession within urban context, if they are relatively like under engaged with, I think, in performance.
Yeah, maybe. I know we're at the end, but something another artist friend said to me who was familiar with the work I'd done, they were like, are you really saying that every time we get a tiny bit of money that we've been fighting for years to do a work in a particular venue, we need to research the history of the venue and whether it's built on histories of violence? Are you saying you want me to do that? Understandable question. I was like, no, I'm not saying that. But there are artists who engage with the histories of the spaces in which they work. Cara Walker is one I'm thinking of, with her big installation in the sugar factory in Brooklyn. Does anybody remember that? And then she did a similar installation of a fountain in Tate Modern in London, obviously. So yeah, it's not Lincoln Center specifically, but Cara Walker comes to mind as a Black feminist artist who's making reparative work in the way of history. Yeah,
I was reading about her today.
Yeah.
It comes in. Okay, we have to wrap up and continue with our evenings, days, afternoons, cats. Thank you, everybody, so much. Thank you, Arabella. That was wonderful. Very like generative and kind of exciting stuff to think with. Thank you for all your questions and contributions. It's also really a huge part of this for me. I feel so activated as soon as you all start talking. Thanks, Ben. And
Thank
next
you.
week,
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Arabella. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone, for coming.